Colleagues, welcome to what we believe is a very special C20 summit panel discussion on global citizens in the age of populism. My name is Anthony McKay, and I am the CEO and President of the National Centre on Education and the Economy in Washington, DC. You will see from the panel participants that we have a remarkable gathering of those who are dedicated to the cause of global citizenship from some very, very significant geographies, institutions, bringing wonderful expertise and experience to this topic tonight, or this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you find yourselves. Just before I ask each of our panel members to introduce themselves, let me just set the scene very briefly. Obviously, global citizenship is at the moment on the minds of all of us, and of course at the centre of the whole of the C20 endeavour. But perhaps never before have we thought about the significance of global citizenship as we have within the COVID-19 environment. But it's not just that. The forces that are with us on a global scene and scale at the moment are ones that are requiring us to be very powerful citizens to solve major challenges. And so to have a panel discussion that can discuss this topic from a variety of perspectives, but also, of course, we are saying in the context of the age of populism, or bringing nationalist perspectives that are very much part of the agenda. So we're hoping that in this period of time we have together on this panel, we can explore four things. One, are we clear about the forces that have given effect to the rise of populism, to the rise of nationalist perspectives? Two, can we and are we seeing a strengthening of international cooperation simultaneously? Are these things competitors, or do they sit in juxtaposition? How do we deal with, on the one hand, those forces that we might see as being around populism and around nationalist perspectives, and how do we deal with that in the context of the need to strengthen our international cooperation? Third, there is also a desire to strengthen communities where people find themselves and live their lives. So how are we simultaneously attending to the global and the local? And fourth, we are saying that if we're going to be effective global citizens, then we need to be globally competent. And right now, there's a real focus on this. In fact, indeed, in this very month of October, toward the end, OECD will release the first assessment of global competence across OECD countries amongst young people. But it's not just young people that need to be globally competent. I think we're saying all generations need to be globally competent and work together. So, colleagues, there are four themes, and we're going to try and tackle all four as briefly as we can, because we haven't got that much time. So each of our panel members are going to be highly disciplined, and they're only speaking for a couple of minutes at a time. But let me be clear, we'd like to hear your voices. Could you please use the chat function from the very start? We'll look at the issues that you are identifying. We're not going to wait until the end. I'll be bringing in your questions as we tackle each of those four areas that I've just outlined. But to make sure that you know who is with us, I'm going to ask each of our panel members if they would just introduce themselves, say where they are coming from, i.e. geographically, but also say where they're coming from in terms of their passion for global citizenship. And you've got to do all of that in 1 minute. So it's a paragraph, not an essay. Paula, you're going to start to model this. Over to you.
Okay. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to all the participants. I'm Italian, as you can understand from my name, and really, I've been passionate about GC since I had pigtails. In the sense, I come from a very simple family. My father was a policeman, my mother a homemaker. But I was lucky enough to meet voluntary educators and general people passionate about people and the world. But it was in a very popular and populated neighborhood where most of the inhabitants had economic and work problems, so concrete problems. And this meeting made me lift my head and be able to look beyond the everyday life and poverty of those around me were. In this path, the school was added, and then the university, and then also the PhD in experimental pedagogy. And these experiences brought me in Africa several times, and then also looking to the people who were originally foreigners, but now, for example, new Italians. So actually looking around and trying to design a more sustainable environment, respecting Agenda 2030, from an ecological, social, and economic point of view, I became president of a non-profit organization named Crea Onlus, involved mainly in intercultural mediation and global citizenship education. So from a voluntary point of view, politically, I am vice president of CIPSI, is in an Italian federation of about 30 NGOs. Also steering group member of the Italian Association and member of Global Citizenship Education and People Engagement Group in Concord, Europe, where I am also member of the board. And actually, I am international educational lead of C20. But concretely, what make me happy to work again on the field, I'm continuing with my work as cognitive anthropologist, trainer, project manager, and also certified mediator and assessor in Feuerstein method.
Wonderful. Paola, thank you. Wow. What a life. Now, don't make this a competition, everybody, okay? Yep. But it's just great to hear a little bit about each of your backgrounds and your passion for this area. So, Othman, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm honestly quite humbled to be here today, especially after that amazing introduction. Thank you, Paula. But I'm Othman. I'm chairing the Y20 this year, so I'm really happy to be here during the C20 summit to talk about global citizenship, which is one of the key topics as well for us in the Y20. And the Y20 is actually my night job in many cases. My day job is actually, I'm a research manager focusing on youth affairs. I worked on a global youth index that focuses on youth development in 25 countries, G20 countries all included here, between the ages of 18 to 30 youth, where we've done a survey on 25,000 of them, and we tackled 5 main themes, one of which is global citizenship. So I'm really glad to be here and give that perspective.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Lydia.
Thank you very much for the introductions I was just saying, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you for involving UNESCO. So my name is Lydia Rupresh. I am team leader for global citizenship education within the organization, the education sector, which leads the global advocacy on global citizenship education within the UN. But my personal story with GCED begins with feminism. And over 15, 20 years of engagement in the area of gender and development. And its work actually brought me to understand that we will not be able to transform the fundamental causes of inequality, of misogyny, or systemic inequality or violence if we don't work on the mainstream. And that means the education system, probably one of the more conservative entities within public institutions. And so that's why I'm passionate about global citizenship and global citizenship education in particular, because over the years I've realized that it's only by working through that institution that we have the vehicle to really change those gender norms and to bring about real fundamental change and greater equality in the world. So that is, in a few words, my personal passion for GCD.
That is wonderful. Thank you, Lydia. Brilliant. Akmal.
Hi, Nisambula Vinake, everybody. My name is Akmal Ali, and I represent the Pacific Islands Association of NGOs, PNGO, which is right now at the background of me. You will see it's a corn shell that symbolizes in the Pacific a source of calling people together. So this meeting that we are having today is going to be discussing a very important issue, which is global citizenship education and how to tackle the evil that we have defined as, which is basically a neutral word, populism. Now imagine living your life and having spent over 30 years of your life as a second-class citizen in your home country. And this because of populist beliefs. Ladies and gentlemen, that is what my exact experience had been living in Fiji. It was not until 2013 when the Fijian government, when the Fijian people got its 2013 constitution, and finally I became a Fijian. Therefore, when having joined the civil society sector and especially being heavily involved with sustainable development goals, when I came across SDG 4.7, it was my answer. It was the answer of my plea and my cry to say, you know what, this is the way forward. Global citizenship education, global unity, multilateralism will only be the way forward to bring this nationalist, this ideologist, this extremist down for the betterment of humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Akmal Ali, and I'm a proud Fijian in a country that is celebrating 50 years of its independence from Great Britain, and I will be part of your panel today. Thank you.
Akmal, thank you very much. I just want you to know that today I'm not in Washington, D.C. I'm in Melbourne, Australia, so I'm your neighbour. Okay?
Love thy neighbour.
Michael.
Well, thanks, Anthony, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm Michael Schaldreck, one of the co-founders and chief policy officer at Global Citizen. And, you know, for us, the relevance is in its name itself. And why did we call this movement Global Citizen? And it's simply because all of the great issues of our time, from climate change to immediate issues such as COVID-19, they can only really be addressed through governments and institutions working together across borders. And like all the big issues of our time, systemic issues can in turn only be addressed through social movements. And so for us, over the last decade, we've come up with a way of mainstreaming these issues, getting them out to as many people as possible, building a platform for people to take action, broadening and deepening their engagement. And to date, we've got over 11 million advocates around the world. You know, these are advocates that tweet, they email, they call, they vote, they call on elected officials, they call on businesses, they call on institutions, foundations to make the changes needed to deliver the sustainable development goals and end extreme poverty. And we often call our approach pop meets policy, because we believe that if we can partner with popular culture, you know, that offers the best way to mainstream these issues and get as many people involved as possible. But through that, you know, we want to deepen people's engagements in the issues as well. And so delighted to be on this panel. It's highly relevant. It's at the core of what we do at Global Citizen.
Brilliant, Michael. Thank you so much.
Oh, and I should say I'm coming to you from Brooklyn, New York.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, look, what an amazing group of people with a passion for this work. And Akmal, I think the way in which you and all of our panel have talked about global citizenship as being the focus of our attention is exactly where we want to land this discussion. But we want to get there by addressing three issues before we get to the fourth, which really is how we promote and develop global citizenship as a very positive force. So again, I'm going to remind people to use the chat, but let me take you to issue one. And Paola, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to ask you, in the spirit in which Akmal has said, listen, the rise of populism, of nationalist perspectives is with us. And how do you see that? Define it for us. Yep. And how does it sit in relation to our ambition to be able to operate as global citizens? How do we do that within the context of rising nationalist perspectives and populism? And I'm asking each of our speakers to address it briefly, and then I'll come back to questions. And please don't think I'm being discourteous if I say to you, you've got 30 seconds left. It's just a prompt. Okay. Bella,
Okay.
the floor is yours.
Okay, I will be brief, absolutely. I imagine that after Lydia will tackle the question of UNESCO perspective on GCE and Rise of Nationalist perspective, I would simply stress the fact that one of the main factors about nationalism is the fact that is based on a presumed homogeneity of the people. Some ethnologues like our Gilles, for example, say that the characteristics of ethnicity is ancestor blood, heart, tongue, external somatic behavioral traits, and so on. And in this sense, also, we had a good contribution from the Ag Center for Strategic Studies in 2017. And I found their study very interesting because they examined the new emerging relationships among peoples. They called adversarial transnationalism, popsovism, or populist sovereignism, something so. They define this as a country native ethnocultural groups that, with their perspective, try to defend themselves against both national and transnational elites. It's not just a question among nationalities, but among people coming from different social classes. And this sovereignist perspective and component advocates for a return to an international order in which the nation state, guided by the self-identified interest of the native ethnocultural population, maintains or reasserts sovereign control over its laws, institutions, and the terms of its international interactions. So supra or international actors and global market forces are absolutely seen as restrictions on the nation state that should be reduced and or opposed. So starting from these feature characteristics, one of the main things that the PopSovs are used to do is increasing in the sovereignty of the nation state and a reduction in the power of civil society organization and international cooperation. And this is exactly the point what I would like to go on. I think that GCE normally envisage a specific role for civil society alongside that of the institutions. But because civil society is not present in all countries, we have to keep this in consideration. I think that talking about this under the presidency of Saudi Arabia is really relevant, because it was possible going through a path in this sense, stressing exactly this point. When we began this journey under Saudi Arabian's presidency, GCE was not named absolutely as one of the most interesting topics for the C20.
Right.
Now it has become a priority. And you can see all the documents. I think that it's one of the main things we have to keep in consideration. So strengthening the role of the civil society, because it helps to the whole to proceed in sense of belonging to the citizenship in global sense.
Well, thank you very much. That is fantastic to set this up. Michael, by the way, colleagues, just when you feel that you want to come in, I'll come to you all, but if you want to come in and ask each other a question, or you want to particularly bounce off something that a colleague said, just insert yourselves. Don't wait to be invited, but I'll make sure all of you have the opportunity. Michael, how do you want to tackle this?
Well, look, I would just say, in terms of understanding the forces at work, I think this sort of populist native nationalism, we often see emerge at times when systems that are meant to deliver for people and meet their needs don't. And I think often populist native solution has this simplistic short-term appeal as an answer to people's ills. But the irony is that so-called globalism or global citizenship, while it's often presented as the enemy to this nativist nationalism, it's actually often only the way we can actually address many of the root causes of the ills that make, this nationalist sentiment so appealing to many people in the first place. If we look at, the fact that many people are angry because corporates, billionaires are often perceived for not paying their fair share of tax, and especially at times when you've got crises like the pandemic, but wealth is skyrocketing, as you've recently seen in the Forbes 400. But again, it's only for a coordinated actual global approach to tax evasion that we would be able to remedy this and ensure that billionaires, the corporates actually do pay their fair share so that systems are resourced and able to deliver for people. I also, look at this in my own experience, my own country, similar to you, Anthony, of Australia. I think it was about a year ago that the Prime Minister down there, Scott Morrison, gave a very anti-globalist speech.
Yep.
The irony is, a year on, he's now signed up to a global approach with over 150 countries to ensure health workers and the most vulnerable are prioritized and get vaccines first. And why is that? It's because he realizes in this age of the pandemic, where no one is safe until everyone's safe, it's actually in Australia's interest. Indeed, it's the only way that it's going to navigate through this. So, for me, I would say, I think the solutions offered by nationalism, don't actually address the root causes. And I think that's often the mirage that we have to, address because the solutions are more complex. But what I would just say is that when we do talk about nationalism, we should be careful we just don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean there is, there's a good book by a friend of mine, Hassan Damlouji. It's called The Responsible Globalist. And in it, he looks at actually what citizens of the world, such as ourselves, can learn from that nationalists if we're ever to build a sense of global identity capable of addressing the great challenges of our time. And really what he looks at there is he looks at, the process of nation building that Germany or Italy went through in the 18th and 19th centuries, and look at what we can learn from there if we're to build a greater sense of global identity. And I think one of the key elements to successful nation building that we could map if we want to build a sense of global nationhood, which I think is necessary if we're ever going to truly address all of these issues. But one of the key ingredients is this idea of a global unifying mission that points to concrete ways of how life will be improved for everyone in the nation. So anyway, just a couple of, I guess, food for thought that I would put out there.
So, Mark, let me just be clear about this. I'm going to go to Othman in a moment, but you draw a distinction. Do you draw a distinction between the language of populism, nationalism, and obviously national identity? These are certainly national identity is a different concept entirely, and you've made that point.
I think
you draw a distinction.
Yeah, I do. I think nationalism itself is actually a process of nation building. And I think the question often becomes, where do you define the boundaries, right? And I think it's not a mistake that the founder of Italian nationalism also spoke of the idea of pan-European nationalism at the same time. But I think what populism is a very nativist defined process. And I think what we've done is we've let the forces of racism, bigotry, xenophobia almost hijack those forces. And I think what can we learn if we're to extend the boundary? Almost the idea you could use the forces of nationalism to extend almost a universal social contract that includes everyone, but it's going to take a lot of work.
Okay, that's great, because I do want to come back to this question about the way in which people usually attach a negative connotation here. You're saying, listen, depending on how you treat this and the forces, it can be a positive force toward understanding the importance of the global, of the interdependent. Yeah, okay. That's great. Othman.
Thank you. One of the key things when we're talking about populist movements all over the world that are currently popping up was what Michael mentioned regarding the lack of trust to deliver for basic services. And I think one of the key challenges here is that when you're talking about looking to the other side and for global collaboration on a specific goal, SDG, G20 goals, and so on and so forth, one of the key questions that usually pop up is, why are we collaborating for these global goals when we can't even find a job here at home?
Yeah.
Or my family is not being respected, or I have food at the table. And then there is this huge sense of frustration, which makes populist movements quite attractive to those people, in the sense that they focus on the short-term goals of, well, we're focusing internally as opposed to externally. And one of the hardest things here is to explain to those people that we all are in this together, that there are many challenges like climate change, global unemployment for youth specifically, as that's what I'm focusing on, are quite, let's say, uniform. And these are challenges that actually cut across all developing countries, not just one or two. And one of the key things here that I would try to push to combat these forces is empathy and putting that into the actual educational curriculum. One of the ways that we have tried to ask young people today on whether they see collaboration or global collaboration to combat these forces that are happening is we asked them a question during the Y20. We have a white paper coming out closer to our summit, asking them, do they know actually of about the UN, the SDGs, the G20, and all of the other international organizations that are for global action? Surprisingly, developing countries, specifically China and India, score quite well. But when you're looking at generally on the average young person, this is not the case.
Thank you. I want to come back to this as we actually pursue the second issue in a moment. But Lydia, what's your perspective on this? Because even in your opening remarks, it was pretty clear that there are some forces at work that you think are huge, and they are absolutely barriers to global citizenship.
There certainly is, and I guess as a feminist, there's the elephant in the room. Speaking of patriarchy, of course, being a systemic forms of it, which is definitely problematic. But before going into that specific issue, I just wanted to say that I guess for us at UNESCO, we were very much concerned with the rise of nationalism 2 years ago, because we saw this coming as it being as something that calls us into question those who are advocating for global citizenship and global citizenship education, thinking, well, first and foremost, it's a sign that we've done something wrong. As this maybe a backlash also to understand, a backlash to promoting a sense of belonging to a global human community. We did an in-depth study of nationalism, and I want to share some of those findings with you to also draw the picture that everybody's been adding to very constructively here. So we also distinguish between populism and nationalism very clearly, because as Michael mentioned, there's pop culture is definitely a form of unity and progress. So populism is not a term that we would tend to use, as it gives a negative connotation to the will of people. So we would talk about nationalism, but nationalism has also, many of you have mentioned, sort of a neutral force, depending on the spectrum where we place the expression of nationalism. So we have a typology of nationalism, distinguishing by level of intensity and level of exclusion. The forms of nationalism that we are more concerned about are the exclusionary, virulent forms of nationalism. And inclusionary, latent nationalism is definitely not problematic. Nationalism that is inclusive to others and has citizenship laws that are open and flexible is very different from virulent and inward-looking forms of nationalism that create camp in and us, etc. So that's a way of all distinguishing the types of nationalisms that are around. But And also the study that we did tried to look at, well, is it true? Is nationalism a real threat? Or is this not a fabrication of those who are concerned with global citizenship? Right? That we overemphasize the size of the threat. And I think we need to put that in perspective. So we also wanted to see what was the situation in that regard. So if I may share just a few lines about that, we did looking at global data, global opinion polls. So looking at attitudes, some indicators that are questionable, and this is not definitive science, so it's debatable. But it gives an idea of where we stand globally on nationalism. Is it serious? Are we seeing a rise of latent, violent and exclusionary forms of nationalism? And our feeling at this point, bottom line, is that while there is a rise of nationalist parties that mean the result of there is no sign there. It's the result of an overall shift in attitudes among people. So they're basically the global opinion polls are showing that there is no significant shift in individuals' attitudes. For example, around indicators such as trust in other nationalities or pride in the nation, question that was asked to people, or isolationism, or a rank of national identity over other identities. Those were the questions asked, and we haven't seen a shift. At least data until 2014 is not showing that we're seeing greater national, maybe to the contrary. In fact, for example, in Europe, we're seeing larger percentage of populations feeling a sense of belonging to a European entity, so non-national entity. However, what we are seeing are more visible expressions and acceptance of nationalist politics, right? So the rise in the electoral success of nationalist parties, but maybe for different reasons, not necessarily ideological. There's a rise in hate crimes that are spurred and triggered by polarized elections, right? And therefore, the assumption is that there is maybe an acceptance of radical and extremist rhetoric, and also a decline in political freedoms and democratic governance over the past decade has, of course, been accentuated by the pandemic. So considering that we don't see in this opinion poll shift in attitude, we are seeing a clear and serious risk of escalation insofar as we're seeing a rise of nationalist politics. And the politics rising in visibility and regaining in political power risk dismantling the institutions that are guaranteeing democracy and openness. So if we don't act quickly, quickly undo and accelerate and speed those institutions guarantee democracy and freedom and openness.
Thank you. That is such a brilliant way of being able to get a through line on the issues we're going to tackle. So I'm going to come back, Lydia, right, and really be clear about, as you say, the complexity of this. You can't talk about it as being like the COVID curve and that, populism is on the rise, it's plateauing and it's on the way down. It depends what form, we are talking about. So this is really important, I think, to our discussion. Akmal, you started us off by making it clear that you are in a place where the way in which populism or nationalist perspectives have actually seriously affected your life. What's the state of play? Are you feeling more optimistic about Fiji at the moment as a geography where you're not experiencing this intensity of what I'd see as being exclusionist? I think that was a great language, Lydia. Exclusionist populism. You're in a better place, Akmal. Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for an excellent question. I think right now Fiji is in a better place. The 2013 Constitution has given us that right to be able to be citizens of this country, to be able to have fair access to all services, to be able to be employed or based on our merits rather than let alone our ethnicities. Now, Anthony, one of the things that I have, in my opinion, let the rise of populism, not only in Fiji, but the rest of the world, is, some charismatic or dominant figure apparently becoming the voice of the mass.
Yep.
And there's two ways they're able to achieve it. First is by showcasing bad manners. And right now we have two global world presidents who have become the epitomes of showing bad manners.
Yep.
And I don't want to name them right now. And the other one is perpetuating a state of national crisis, which is motherland needs us, motherland wants us. This country, for example, Fiji for Fijians, Indians, or something like that. So then a normal person, when they look at it, they look at the other races as the trouble, as the problem. And in order to come out of that emergency situation, because these people, what we must understand, the right-wing populists really speak the people's language. They really simplify. They talk in terms that a normal individual at the grassroots level will be able to understand and people can associate with. So, for example, right, in certain country, they said fuel prices was really high and an average person could not afford it. So everybody said, you know what, we must remove this government to make cheaper fuel prices. But hey, guess what? When the populist government came in, fuel prices is 5 times higher than it was. But then again, because of the populist ideologies, while I will tell you this, just I will take 1 more minute of your time. The Pacific has always been a victim of the populist culture. Why? I'll tell you this. Climate change. We are the least of the polluters, but the biggest of the victims. Today, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, the Tuvalu are 3 of the vulnerable small island states that is threatened to go underwater in the next 50 years.
Yep.
We are threatened by climate change every day. Did you all know that the United States, France, and the United Kingdom have carried out a total of 568 nuclear tests in the Pacific, ladies and gentlemen, and all in the name of nationalism and defending their motherland. And the Pacific today is paying the cost of it by suffering with cancer, with so many different types of cancer. The dome in Marshall Islands is damaged and the US is not taking responsibility of it. The Pacific is on a ticking time bomb. Did you also know that the 67 bombs tested by the United States in Marshall Islands from 1946 to 1958 was equivalent to 1 Hiroshima every day for 12 years? That is how bad it was. And then, ladies and gentlemen, the last point about the Pacific, and it is why we are really passionate about it. Well, I faced populism in my country, but then again, we realized that there were some Western forces. They had to make sure that Fiji abided and depended on them, and therefore were always a UN vote. 11 Pacific Island countries to date are still colonized by populist country, and these includes France, the United States, New Zealand, and other countries. But the Pacific, 11 countries, while the rest of the world in the G20 summit are sovereign, can stand for their national rights, 11 Pacific Island countries cannot stand and say, we have our own identity. For the people of the Pacific have always been independent. Now, where is equality? So if people in the Western world, because they are so privileged, are saying that, you know, they are suffering from populism, guess what? The Pacific has been suffering, the Pacific is suffering, and if the world doesn't do anything, the Pacific will continue suffering. Thank you.
Akmal, thank you. Michael, let me turn to you and shift to what the chat is saying to us. We've got 3 or 4 participants who are with us on this panel. Observing and now participating through the chat and saying, listen, there are some pretty positive signs. Yeah. Nobody is taking the position that I've seen so far that they're not seriously worried, to use Lydia's language, around the virulent, the inward-looking, the exclusionist, and actually, Akmal, your very point about the way in which the Pacific and other places have been the victims of this kind of nationalist position, yeah? But at the same time, Michael, people are saying, hold on, I think it's in the spirit of what Lydia said too about movements within Europe. There are signs of hope.
Yeah.
International cooperation, right, is with us. And by the way, it's not only with us by the movements of institutions and agencies, it's with us with young people leading the work. It's with us with people defeating populist parties at elections. So Michael, what's your sense? It's not just COVID, right? It's not just COVID.
No, I think there's actually a very, I think it's an inspiring story, actually. You know, Switzerland has often been seen as the kind of laboratory for where right-wing populist politics gets experimented and then gets exported to the rest of the continent. And it's been like that. The SVP in Switzerland's been successful for the last 25 years. But I think starting 6 or 7 years ago, a group of young people in Switzerland, really took destiny into their own lives and said, is this the kind of country we want to live in? And, their first victory was actually in 2016 when a proposal, in Switzerland, and I know we get into representative democracy, but Switzerland probably has the most referendums and direct forms of participation of vote in the world. But there was a proposal around deportation in which, migrants and others, their rights would be restricted. And a group of young people started entering the campaign. It looked like this proposal was going to win. And what they did very cleverly is they didn't make the referendum about immigration. They made it actually about Swiss values. They made it about the rule of law. And they said, this is about equal justice under the law. No one should arbitrarily have their rights stripped away from them. And I think when they won this referendum, it was the leader of the SVP, this populist right-wing party in Switzerland, who said all of a sudden it was about immigration and we were winning. Then all of a sudden it became about the rule of law. And I don't know what happened, and they lost. And I think, they've had a string of victories against this group in Switzerland. And I think most recently, just last week, September 27th, there was a proposal around immigration curbs, essentially, pro or anti-immigration. And this referendum lost again by a landslide, I think. And so I think it's a telling example of where young people, and this movement is led by people in their 20s, in their early 30s, of where they've come out and they've sought to redefine what Switzerland and their values stand for, and say, what sort of country do we want to live in? And I would just say, and I pick up on the last point, I would just say, I think, in our movements around the world on global citizenship, often it actually shows our bias towards the Western media, because we have this narrative of the rise in populist politics. But I do think, and Lydia mentioned some of the studies, there are some encouraging studies that when you look at places, whether it's from Nigeria, whether it's in Asia, that particularly amongst young people, there are positive attitudes towards global citizenship. People do see themselves as a citizen of the world, even at a time if in Western countries that's not necessarily as strong as it was in the past. So there are some glimmers of hope. Is a global nation emerging? Perhaps that's too early to say. Perhaps we're at a crossroads, but there are things there, case studies that we can lean on.
Lydia, where do you stand on this? Are you seeing the strengthening of weak signals, and maybe just leave politics, or at least national politics, aside for one moment? What are you seeing that makes you more potentially confident that the negative side of populism, nationalist perspectives, that negative side is on the decline, and on the incline is international cooperation? Question mark?
If I have to focus on the positive, I would say that I'm comforted to see that there is a strong voice among young people, yes, but not only, because I think we can't necessarily progress in positive terms if we don't also connect youth voices with established institutions, political parties, unions, I mean,
Yeah.
I think that is
Yeah.
we are calling for the safeguarding of the rule of law, and not for
Yeah.
for a clash of civilizations and cultures or a clash of generations. I think it's important. So I think that I'm encouraged when I see young people, but also those who are safeguarding those public institutions, starting to seriously look at now for several years how we want to maybe redefine democracy and participative democracy. That there is and the idea that being democratic is not just limited to voting, and that people are taking part in voting budgets, local budget, community budget, for example, that they want to be informed of what's happening in the community and taking responsibility collectively, not just individually, but as a collective, of how to make improvements in their immediate community. Because I think that is some of the lessons learned that we haven't got to yet, but we'll get to later in the conversation. So based on the assessment of the threats of nationalism, how should we be maybe shifting our strategies as we are promoting global citizenship through education? Because there is a need to shift our strategies. We can't do business as usual. Things have changed, and we need to adapt. And one of the ways of adapting is to realize that we've disinvested the importance of not just the local but the community, right? And how to empower the community and being involved in decision making as a collective. So I get enthusiasm, or at least from seeing that happen, and it is happening.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Othman, come in. What's your own perspective? And by the way, it's interesting that we're getting through the chat function some issues about, again, geography. Is there a variable here about small countries versus large? Is there, to go to your point, Michael, is there a global north, global south, right? What are the dimensions of this as we think about it in the way in which we appreciate or understand different parts of the globe? So, Othman, if you want to play that in, feel free.
I still think that, well, there are some definitely positive signs when it comes to young people and overall engagement on global issues. And I think that's mostly due to just how generations are defined nowadays with technology, right? For example, my younger brother, Saud, probably has more in common in terms of his likes and dislikes with Rajesh in India as opposed to with me, his own brother in the same house. And generations today have more in common in terms of age groups than it is only by geography. And I think that's one of the reasons, or one of the elements or levers where policymakers could utilize to encourage empathetic conversations worldwide. I do think, though, when it comes to geography, there are still some challenges. There is a clear divide, at least from a research perspective, between developed countries and developing countries, specifically on global citizenship, and even on other metrics on unemployment, entrepreneurship, for example, and other elements as well when it comes to even participating in civic duties and responsibilities. At least within the Y20, we have three priority areas, of course, and one of them is global citizenship, and one of the key priorities under that is multiculturalism. And we see within our delegates, a lot of the policies that they have suggested always push for increased collaboration, increased cooperation amongst all of the countries that are participating within the Y20 this year. But this is a theme that's been part of the Y20 since the start 10 years ago. Yeah. The real question, though, is, are young people actually aware of platforms like the Y20? Are they actually aware of platforms like the Y7? Are there enough global participatory platforms for young people? And the answer is no. When you're thinking about people who are younger than 30, you're talking about 50% of the world's population. Are they actually being involved locally and internationally in the most proper way? And I don't think that's the case. Y20 is a very rare type of platform where leaders can engage with young people. And even then, it's at their pace. It's not at the pace of young people. When we're looking into the key challenges, for example, that young people would really love to be a part of, and we surveyed 10,000 young people this year, the three top challenges that came up, or global challenges that came up, is climate change, unemployment, and global health, of course, due to COVID-19. And our delegates would have loved to spend more time to talk with the G20 working groups on this.
Let me Paula and Akmal, can I ask you maybe to make a bridge between what we might be seeing as some very positive activity around international engagement and cooperation with what, Othman, you just made clear. Are there opportunities both locally and globally? So Paula and Akmal, I'm going to ask you to make whatever comment you want about the international participation in activities that we see as being positive. But could you also say a word about what you see happening locally? Because there's a real sense in which people have been frustrated about what I think, Lydia, you refer to of levels of participation. If you can't participate in your own country at a local community level and build your expertise and your commitment, right, your capacity to be as effective as a change agent and activist on the global international scene, right, I think has got a bit of a question mark over it. And so, Paula, take us into both the international and the local. Do you see some positive moves taking place about community level action, more participative decision-making that people can become involved in, and not just simply, as both you and Lydia said before, you know, an opportunity at the polls every now and again to make a contribution? What's your feeling? Are we getting a strengthening of both international and local at community level?
Can I
get Paula? Oh, do you want to go first, Paula or Akmal? Which one wants to go first?
Akmal.
Akmal, you've got the floor.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Paula. Well, thank you very much for an excellent question. You brought up a very important issue. The one of the first things we have to look at is that the populist content is usually made out of negatives. One of the things that populism actually rises is and I have seen that with my own eyes in Fiji, is when we have a sense of entitlement. When citizens become proactive, they take charge of their lives, they believe in enhancing their own selves, then there is no sense of entitlement. But if a group of people, because they belong to a particular age group, a particular gender, they think they're entitled to something, this actually fuels in the flame of populism. And I'm not saying this by pointing a finger at everybody, but by what I experienced from 1987 to 2013 in Fiji. Now, the challenge that currently we are facing from local at the local level, Anthony, you know, the first thing that the Western world must come out of it is the colonialist mentality that the South or the people who they colonized were basically uncivilized. Wherever the Western world goes, you know, sometimes one day somebody said Ferdinand Magellan discovered the Pacific, and I said, when was the Pacific lost that he had to discover it? The Pacific has always been where it was. And for your information, the Pacific had, and until today, our navigation knowledge was the most advanced. And for 40,000 years, Pacific Islanders had navigated the oceans of the Pacific.
Yeah.
And in ships. But when the Westerners came in, James Cook did not want the rest of the world to see that the Pacific Islanders were actually traveling between islands and actually conquering the Pacific Oceans in their ships, and actually were traveling in hundreds. They decided to really scale down in ratio, maybe 1:1,000, and make little punts and canoes. And when the missionaries came, they said, you know what, you do not go to indigenous knowledge, because this will make you prehistoric and uncivilized, and it will not make you favorable with God. Now, I know I'm really passionate about it, but what you must understand is, if you go to Fiji or the Pacific Islanders do not need capacity building anymore. We are already a group of educated people. We have lived here for thousands of years. We know how to decide. However, there is possibility of capacity strengthening, which is a partnership, because the Western world must, rather than trying to make us understand their ways, should try to understand the ways of the other people, the indigenous people,
Yes.
the local people, the rest of the world. And the populist must also realize that it is at the cost of the so-called uncivilized or the developing country. Their countries have developed. I mean, which of these countries were not a colonialist power, and which of these countries were not the ones that came and drained out their countries of resources, whether it's whether it was India, whether it was Fiji through sugarcane production. All of these countries, all of us have been drained out of our resources. And now, when they have taken everything, today they are trying to come and attack our oceans and do deep sea mining. So it is quite alarming. It is quite alarming. Yeah. But my last point here, Anthony, I think what we really need to do is, populism basically is a neutral term. We must be able to bring in positive narratives and bring in order to I consider myself as a positive populist, because I'm united by a single principle. I believe in putting power in people's hands, and it means in our hands, which is in practical terms, I would say, for example, if a pro-worker economic agenda designed to lift the living standards and reduce the economic anxiety of the majority of working families whose incomes fell as economic power was concentrated in the hands of the elite. So therefore, we must work on to becoming positive populist. So in order to eradicate the negative, we must bring in the positive narratives. There has to be a paradigm shift, because in order to cut diamond, we use diamond. So in order to really to eradicate the right wing, we must bring in positive populism.
Thank you. And this is where positive populism, all right, the way in which you express that, you then talk about a shift in power. So, Paula, I want to ask you this question. Are you seeing a shift in power at the local level as well as being expressed through international agency? But at the local level, are you witnessing now communities that are deeply committed to participation, to exercising influence, right, to having control over their lives? What do you feel? Is there a shift to power at the community level rather than just in the hands of government?
Exactly, this is the problem. I mean, Anthony, I am reflecting on what you said, and starting from an inner point of view. I mean, Italia now is well known also for Salvini, and at local level, you know that there are many struggles in terms of polarization, perhaps more than nationalist or populist. But from this point of view, if I try to cope with this at grassroots level with young people, for example, using some tools financed by United Nations or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, etc., as it happened concretely, I cannot talk about something that is too high for young people. I mean, right. I had a good experience. We carried on a project named Young People, New Storytellers and Actors of Development Cooperation. What we did, we started from the experience they had with the Fridays for Future. That is well known everywhere in the world. But when I asked to the pupils inside the schools, what you know about the pollution, really, about what is happening, etc., nobody gave me a right answer. I mean, it was just an emotional answer, okay? So I started exactly from this point of view, saying, okay, if you want to put concretely at your level, what is the changing situation, what you would ask? And we organized a sort of meeting with all the candidates for major in our city. and we are not exactly in Rome. We are in the surrounding, so more or less 30 kilometers from Rome, 30. And in this sense, pupils started to think about what they said all around them. So about the environment, we had a sort of street with a lot of rubbish and people left so in the street. So they started to think how I can change the situation in this sense. For example, it was absolutely a bad situation coming in Palestrina, that is the place. And after they started to think how effectively to put better the situation here, and they asked to the potential measure to change the situation. And we had a discussion with them, putting together all the candidates, and they solicited also their families. So also elder people arrived all around, also if they knew anything about Fridays for Future or something so, and they started discussed. Finally, one was voted, that's sure. You can imagine it was not exactly the leftist, if I can say rightly the situation. But anyway, it was one who said, okay, I will put €1 per citizen on raising this kind of discussion among the population.
Yeah.
So in this sense, for me, it's a good way. I mean, not starting from big identities, big means, because effectively youth feel absolutely unable, non-active to insert themselves in this kind of dialogue. But if you start with them building exactly the situation at local level for pushing after this situation to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as we did, that was for them an interesting experience. And I
Fantastic.
found, yeah, really.
Well, okay, this is a perfect connection, Lydia, to what I'd like you to make an assessment of. Let me make an assertion. Yep. The assertion is that we have got an emergence of an understanding that we'd better build global competence at every level, local and global, if we are going to tackle the wicked problems that we have before us, right? And it'll only be through the kind of citizenship that has the skills, the knowledge, the values, and the dispositions. This is not just about any old activity, right? This is about being a global citizen with competence. And the reason why I raised at the start of this conversation that we've got the first OECD, at least, countries, yep, this shows that, in fact, it's risen to the top of the agenda in many, many countries. Now, we can talk about what all the dimensions are. People know them, of global citizenship or global competence. But I can remember earlier on in this conversation when Othman was talking about the ethical, the socially responsible, right? The empathetic. All of that is part of this. What's your sense, Lydia? Are we at the beginning of building not only just this generation, but the other point that people were making was it better be an intergenerational. Yep, I think you yourself referred to this. So give me a sense of how what's the state of play? Are we really seeing the emergence of globally competent citizens?
Well, we're on. It's in the making.
It's in the making, right?
It's in the making. I think that you're absolutely right that to say, and this is something a message we've been trying to carry for several years now in UNESCO, that education, basic education, or education as we know it, is not sufficient to be able to foster the type of awareness and knowledge and values and attitude that we were discussing here today. we need a quality education, quality of a good education, good quality, but that means, and we need to unpack that, it means relevant education, and even that needs to be unpacked. What is relevant? And that's where we bring in the cultural perspective that was raised by Akmal, which is now a very important strand of work that we have, how to have those other forms of knowledge systems reflected in education, that we have decolonized educational content. It's about relevance in that sense as well. That means it allows people to attain a sustainable and peaceful livelihood. But it's relevance also in the sense that it is looking at the whole individual, and it's not just the brain or the heart or the hands, the symbols. I think to think and to feel and to do, but it's broken up in pieces. That the education system, and here I'm talking about the formal education, because education starts at home, and at home we have the values and many things, and out of education through life. And I mean, in formal education, we need to see the individual in its totality. So it's about relevant holistic education, right? So we are talking about cognitive skills and social, emotional skills and behavioral skills. And that's why I think you have a wonderful panel there, because through all of our work, we are developing these skills and these dimensions. They're fundamental global citizenship education. But once again, going back to my first statement, means of education or education systems are sometimes the most conservative. So while we all may agree that transformation of society begins with a transformation of self, of one's awareness, aware of where we're coming from, of one's subjectivity and how we were unique and we are different from others, and being aware of one's difference. It's difficult to teach, and especially to get education systems to accept that. So it's a long process, and I of course there are there's a lot of progress that has happened around the world, and monitoring is one way we bring governments accountable. That has been the logic of the Sustainable Development framework, and I think the OECD assessment framework they're going to launch on the 22nd and 23rd of October. So that a sort of I can't say a sister UN agency, say a comrade agency of the OECD have done a great effort in trying to build consensus among the OECD countries of what is these global competencies. However, I mean, there are other frameworks. I mean, UNESCO has its own framework, it's maybe more grounded in values and human rights, and we would have their framework is maybe more oriented toward the world of work. Because of the nature of the institution. But I think we are basically working towards this idea that we need to better assess the situation now to be able to reform education systems. If we don't know how well or what we're learning today from the system, how can we steer it in the right direction?
I love that, because I mean, let's be clear. There's been some references to particular frameworks. There's Othman, there's multiple frameworks. And when you said before about are we aware of the multiple platforms? Are you feeling that? Are you a little more optimistic about the forces that are starting to build? That obviously, for our purposes, I mean, we're talking about the C20 summit, and we're placing global citizenship at the centre. Are you feeling as if this next decade is going to be something different? And I'm thinking about that in terms of the sustainable goals and 2030. I mean, I know there's only 5 years away, but what's your feeling?
Well, part of me, I always bet on young people, so that goes without saying. The issue is are they actually prepared?
Right.
We know that young people in general tend to be optimistic, and we actually, in the Global Youth Index, young people in developing countries were more optimistic than young people in developed countries. But the issue is that whether this optimism can be harnessed in the proper way, and whether young people actually know where to harness their own energy towards is another question altogether. Let me just bring some facts here into the question.
By the way, I'm really pleased you're doing this, because that's what the chat's saying. Can we be clear about purpose? Can we be clear about meaning? Can we be clear about the nature of the participation?
Right. And so we've done a white paper on global citizenship this year as part of the Y20. And in it, we asked youth multiple questions. And what we found out, and we basically were asking, is global citizenship working or not? And here are some key takeaways from the paper, first time that we share this. About 44% to 40% of youth have a strong understanding of the EU and the UN. Only 29% of G20 youth could explain the SDGs to a friend unassisted. Young people's top 3 global issues are climate change, unemployment, and public health. 81% of youth access news through social media. 61 check media for accuracy at least once a week. And educated youth from China and India have the strongest understanding of international institutions. So, am I positive? I would say cautiously optimistic on the future route here, but I'm optimistic for young people. And I think I would add that education isn't necessarily the only way to solve this. It's definitely an important way, but youth consume media online. And we know, for example, that, and they also utilize media for activism, right? Like there is like fan activism, trolling online, and all of these other ways that youth can push this frustration out, utilizing, global, let's say, pop culture into their own methods here. But also how information gets to them is quite important. And I think that's where a lot of the challenges get to be showcased. I mean, education is of course a direct way in which you can showcase to youth what global citizenship is, how global citizenship is important. But in their daily life, in their daily interactions online, which is where youth tend to propagate and share information, if those places have different rhetoric, then that's dangerous.
Got it. Michael, fantastic. Michael, I've got to ask you this because, and then I'll go to Lydia. But let me just ask you this, Michael. You've got a bit of a brand advantage. and you've got 11 million advocates out there, right?
Yeah.
But I think you make a point here. We could have this conversation in terms of what global institutions are doing, what the UN is doing, how UNESCO is operating, why it's useful for OECD to be doing the work around global competence. But I think you would also say to us, and it's come up on the chat as well, hey, listen, we're not necessarily waiting for those vehicles.
Yeah.
So where would you be wanting to actually point to as evidence that there's more than institutional platforms that are being set up?
Yeah, I mean, look, just from our own experience, I would just say it's telling in April. And look, I love the UN, I love the World Health Organization, so I think those institutions are great. But in the early days of the pandemic, it was interesting. We received a call from the UN and the WHO, and they were worried just exactly about what's occurring now, the pandemic driving wedges in countries. And they actually said, can you do something we can't? You partner with artists, and you can see behind me, these are all of our various global citizen festivals we've held over the years. And they said, can you do something, bring people together, around music, because music is a language, music is a language that transcends borders, right? And so very quickly we started just organically with a few of our artist partners, Coldplay, John Legend, them just posting to Instagram talking about, how we were all in this together. And then from that, we had other artists jump on board, and that steamrolled until April 18th, One World Together at Home. And I think it was amazing. You saw for us, this singular day, and maybe it's because we all had this shared experience around lockdown, but millions of people tuned in, and it was the theme of one worldism that people were tuning into, this idea of standing in solidarity with health workers everywhere. And it wasn't about institutions. In fact, we made the decision we would focus on health workers, those on the front lines. But it was extraordinary. This trended #1 from Brazil to Mexico to Nigeria to South Africa to India to France to Canada, back home in Australia. It was extraordinary to see that sentiment. And I would say that, it's telling the UN and WHO reached out to activists like us, because we can tell that story, we can connect people. And I would just say, I think any education system should look at, okay, if you go back to that element of nation building, and this is what we can learn from nationalism, that idea of a global unifying mission, you know, it's not institutions. I think it's embedded. I think we have it in the global goals for sustainable development, in the Paris Agreement. But I think these need to be reframed. They need to be reframed as improving the lives for everyone. You know, it's not about rich, it's not about poor. We've seen in this pandemic the fallacy of rich, poor. You know, some so-called wealthy countries have fared much worse than poorer countries. It's exposed the inequities in those countries. But if we can reframe this global development, and I think as part of that, you know, and this is me being a bit provocative, I think it also needs to have a conversation that, okay, where does the buck stop in terms of bankrolling this global development? And I think traditionally we've thought of it in terms of, you know, rich countries helping poor countries. Again, we need to get beyond that, because if you look at those rich countries, who are most of the people paying it? It's not the wealthy people in those countries. It's the squeezed middle class, those who are having issues around unemployment. And so we're basically asking the plumber in East London to bankroll all of global development. And I think they would rightly ask the question, well, what about the billionaires here? What about the wealthy? What are they doing? And I think as part of this, we need to have a conversation about transferring the moral obligation to middle-class taxpayers in Western countries to, frankly, rich people everywhere. And again, global cooperation is the best way to do that. But anyway, I'll stop there. The only other thing I'll just say is Akmal made a comment earlier about his experience in Fiji and about the history around James Cook. And as an Australian growing up, I completely agree with you. And I think, you know, the idea of an effective education really needs to embody that sense of self-reflection in history. You know, I had a few fortunate teachers that shared the history of colonialism in Australia. But I really think we're seeing right now in America with the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of Americans didn't know the significance of Juneteenth. It was only 150, 60 years ago that people were enslaved here. And then the Brits said slavery isn't about Britain, it's an American phenomenon. Well, actually, no, slaves came because of the British Empire and the transatlantic slave movement. So I think, you know, I completely concur with those sentiments as well.
All right, I'm going to go to Lydia, but Lydia, I'm going to ask you to help me here to model what is actually going to be your final opportunity. So you can say whatever you like, but could you add to whatever you're going to say the question I'm going to ask all of you, and that is where you are going to put your discretionary effort as activists in order to promote global citizenship over this next immediate period. Where have you determined that this is where you can get the greatest leverage? And this is global citizenship that we've said on this discussion that simultaneously serves the global and the local, right? And that in fact it could easily serve what we might see as being the growth in positive national identity, the growth in local activism in communities, and our commitment to international cooperation. So whatever dimension, where are you going to put your discretionary effort? And so Lydia, whatever you want to say, but can you add a response to my question? And you've got a minute and a half.
Okay, Ruthless. Yes, I guess what I wanted to say earlier is that I think we have to put in context to answer the question concretely what can be done. Is to say that global citizenship education is also very much so an aspiration that is in reality expressed, yes, virtually on global terms, but in very material terms, so physicality at a very local level. And I think we've probably done insufficient here, have done more of it, but to look at what does it mean to be a global citizen locally?
Yeah.
And how does that translate in our immediate? And that maybe is a way of, I think, maybe putting the global in parenthesis a little bit, because I think that around the term global, there's a lot of malaise as well. Who's global? Whose values? You know, does it global conflict with national and local? And I mean, it gets into complications that we've seen a lot when we do our work. So I think it's about looking at complexities and seeing how my reality at a local level determined by a series of factors internationally, regionally, intra-locally or international, intranational, different levels, different sectors of society. We're all interconnected, but at multiple levels in different ways. So it's not just local, but and multiple horizontal and vertical. So it's about dealing with complexity and understanding that and acting at a local level, which means that what would be my priority area of work at the immediate, which is precisely that, is to see how can we bring culture and ways of being together or ways of being, actually, the cultural dimension into global citizenship education, revisiting our understanding and our work on global citizenship to make it grounded in locality and culture. So that is something that UNESCO is now working on. Arts, culture, and global citizenship education, decentering message.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Othman, you've got 60 seconds.
All right. So I think for my side, where we're talking about the Y20 here, one of the key things is we're betting, of course, on young people. I mean, within the Y20, most of the people that are the delegates are between the ages of 20 to 35. And one of the things I think in the immediate future that I'm working on to support global citizenship is submit a darn good communique to the G20. And that's coming up here in the next week, inshallah, as we get closer to the G20 summit. But when it comes to global citizenship and global citizenship education, I think what we know or in the research and with my conversations with young people is that young people are optimistic. They lean towards global citizenship. I think across their different geographies. And I think betting on that, especially for global goals such as the SDGs or any other global mandate, is the way to go. And involving them in decision making, ensuring they're empowered, but as well as involved meaningfully to participate in how they're being included into these goals.
Brilliant. Akmal, okay, tell me, where are you going to put your discretionary effort? How will you advance this global citizenship agenda in the immediate?
Well, I think the agenda is already there, and 193 countries have agreed to it. And
right.
It is all very well stated in the Sustainable Development Goals. Yep. And Goal 4.7 is very clear. Now, in order to make this a reality, there are few things that we need to do. I think the SDGs, rather than becoming a voluntary agreement, had to be a binding agreement for the governments, something that should have been agreed as compulsory. Every year, and I have been part of the VNR process, governments come, report voluntarily on the goals, on the targets, indicators, and goals that they have implemented in their country, but most of them is quite tokenistic. Governments need to get serious. And in order to make global citizenship a reality, I think there is a few things that we need to do. The first is we must be able to nurture a sense of belonging to humanity as a whole. And this is a moral obligation and responsibility of a country. The second thing is countries, in order to start with education, whether it's their young or any system, must introduce in their countries the concept of global classrooms, the importance of multilateralism, so that citizens can think globally, feel regionally, and act locally. And very importantly, we need citizens to become active national citizens so that they can become active regional citizens who in the end become active global citizens. In order to achieve SDG 4.7, I am of the opinion that there has to be an emphasis on SDG 16 and SDG 17. And civil society has
15 seconds.
And civil society has a very important role to play in it, because and we civil society, so goal 17 talks about SDGs can only become a reality with a genuine partnership between government, civil society, private sector, and UN agencies. I think it is high time that government, civil society, private sector, and the UN agencies genuinely work together. Civil society is working, but the government and private sector, they need to work the talk. Thank you.
Superb, superb. Paula,
Yeah. Few
where are you going to
comments.
put your effort?
Yeah. Raising the issue also at political level where it's not present, as we did with the presidency this year. Secondly, invest in solidarity organization, giving them the right of initiatives on issues and priorities. Include the GCE component in all future development cooperation programs, and allocate at least 3% of all official development aid on, because without resources, also money, resources, it's impossible to do anything. That's all.
Superb. Michael, you got the last word.
Look, I would just say, for our part, crises are often remembered for as much as how they end, for how they begin. And I think if we look at the current pandemic, we know that if countries embrace vaccine nationalism, a few countries hoard vaccines at the expense of all, it's going to prolong the crisis. It's actually going to damage the economy longer. The only way we can address it is vaccine multilateralism. The world has a plan, but I always think, as I began my remarks, leaders always listen to people. Like, accountability is key to delivery at the end of the day. And I think if we can end the crisis by working together, because let's face it, no one is safe until everyone is safe, and citizen power is fundamental to that. I think we can come up for a blueprint for working together. It can show what's possible. It might seem hard at the moment. There's a lot of angst in the world, but we only have to look 75 years ago at the end of the Second World War. If you look at America, in the late 30s, isolationism was rife. I don't think many people in America saw themselves as citizens of the world. There's a great book that's just come out by Samuel Zipp called The Idealist, that tells a story about, in a very few short years, the idea of one worldism had actually captured the imagination of millions of Americans and helped lay the groundwork for the UN. So I think crises can sometimes serve as a positive aftershock. And I think maybe there's a glimmer, but it's going to take citizens to hold our leaders to account. And maybe, who knows, 10 years' time, when a story is written about this year, maybe it will actually be as a roadmap to global cooperation and the emergence of the global nation, which may or may not be in waiting as we speak.
Michael, thank you, because all of you, colleagues, 5 remarkable colleagues, activists who have given meaning, deep meaning to the topic, right? Global citizens in the age of populism, advancing a positive agenda for action. Anybody that's been with us on this 90-minute journey, I think, would find it hard not to feel a sense that, in fact, we do have a very positive agenda for action. We've got an opportunity now to make a serious, serious contribution. And as you point out, Michael and others, we'd better take this opportunity. Now, this is the moment. This is the decisive decade, and this may well be the decisive year. Thank you, colleagues, all. Fantastic conversation. Thanks for those who contributed through the chat. And obviously, this is a remarkable summit, a C20 summit that puts global citizenship right at the heart, is our global endeavour. Thank you all, and we look forward to the continuing work. Don't move, stay where you are, and just wave. Okay, thank you very much.
Bye.